There we go. That's weird. Oh man, that's funny. I gotta check the. There's a cool image of Jesse leading singing.
Doing what? Oh.
Here? Right, yeah. It's the camera's just stuck. Oh, that's interesting. That's not right, is it?
Chris is seeing stuff we're not seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, he's right. I saw it over here too.
Well, all right. Well,
Well,
let's see.
when in doubt, always unplug and start over.
I don't know. Something must have happened. I know the power went out in Bremen last night, but I don't think that happened here.
Y'all have a storm
I don't know.
in Bremen?
No,
I don't think it'll
there
be.
wasn't a storm. It was just the power went out. So I have no idea. This may or may not. There it goes. Okay. All right. So we're online, it looks like. So we'll continue on. So we're going to be continuing tonight with our study from Mere Christianity. We're on chapter 4 of book 1, I believe, What Lies Behind the Law, in which Lewis builds on his previous argument that a universal moral law exists. He now asks, what kind of universe must this be for such a law to make sense? We're going to read from the text here. So let's sum up what we have reached so far, Lewis says. In the case of stones and trees and things of that sort, what we call the laws of nature may not be anything except a way of speaking. When you say that nature is governed by certain laws, this may only mean that nature does, in fact, behave in a certain way. The so-called laws may not be anything real, anything above and beyond the actual facts which we observe. Does that make sense? Okay, so it is semantics, but you understand that when we say law, I mean, if you're going to define law, we're defining it as just the way things act. I mean, that at the bare minimum, that is how you could consider it. So it may not be laws in the way that we think that there is a lawgiver, I suppose. So, playing devil's advocate, let's say that that's the best that we can say is that things just happen because they happen, because that's just the way it is. It is what it is, right? So the so-called laws may not be actually real things, anything above and beyond the actual facts which we observe. Rocks fall down when you let them go. But in the case of man, we saw that this will not do. The law of human nature, or of right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else, a real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. Okay, so there are two major worldviews here. I want to now consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there. And very roughly, two views have been held. I don't know, I had this image in my head. He says, ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering. And I was like, well, that'd be Adam, wouldn't it? But why does he say men? Ever since men have been able to think. It seems kind of sexist to me. I think he probably, we'll say that he means men and women. But anyway, ever since men were able to think, they've been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there. And very roughly, two views have been held. First, there is what is called the materialist view. That's the way he phrases it, or the materialistic view, we might call it. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed. Nobody knows why, and that the matter, behaving in certain fixed ways, has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. Now, I will ask you this question. This was written what, just right after the World War, or during the World War II. So, how long has that been now? Yeah. So, has anything changed in this assessment of the materialistic view? Is there anything new in the realm of science?
No, that really goes all the way back to Epicurus, thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
From the Greeks.
Well, they know now that matter has not always existed, that it had a beginning.
They?
The
Who's they?
scientists,
Some,
materialists.
It depends on-
some
well, the
materialists.
objective scientists do, but many of them still hold it.
It still depends on who you ask.
No.
Well, I mean, okay, so you're thinking about the Big Bang, right? You're thinking about everything just sprang into existence from nothingness. Well, I mean, that is a view, but okay, so let's take it two different ways. So that means that there was no such thing as time. So in that sense, there was no time before the Big Bang. So at T0 for the entire existence of time, there's been the material universe, and we don't know how it got here. But scientists generally will say, well, yeah, but even then, we know that something had to have existed before that, and so that's the big crunch. So what happened? What created the material that crunched together? Well, that was another Big Bang, and then another Big Bang, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a couple of different ways to look at it.
The oscillation view is nothing but warmed over Hinduism.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the scientists, they cloak their religious views in quasi-scientific sounding language, but that's all it is.
It is, and
And a lot of them consciously, I think Niels Bohr, people like that, they're very much steeped in Hinduism, Eastern mysticism. But as physicists, people thought they were doing physics when they weren't. They were doing metaphysics.
yeah, and if you want to really drive that point home, you go back to the old turtle joke, right? It's turtles all the way down. The Earth rides on the back of a turtle. Well, that's quaint, ma'am, but what's the turtle riding on top of? Well, another turtle. Okay, two turtles. What's under that? Another turtle. Okay, well, hey, it's turtles all the way down, okay? Just shut up about the turtles. So that's the response you get. I mean, and it's just as ridiculous as the turtle, the Earth on the back of a turtle argument, right? Because you have to come back to something that makes rational, reasonable sense, or it's a religion, right? Either it is rational, scientific, it has the materialistic view and it makes sense and it explains everything, or it's a religion. And at this point, it has to be a religion because science, and we'll get into this in just a moment, you can't use the scientific method to measure any of this, to determine any of this stuff. So at some point, faith comes into play. And it's either the blind faith that comes from the scientific world that they just want you to believe without any kind of evidence, because there is no evidence and there is nothing but conjecture that everything came from nothing, and that nothingness was precursored by more something and more nothing. The oscillation theory, as Philip said, or there was literally nothing. There was absolutely nothing, no laws, no rules, no matter, no anything at all, absolute nothingness, and then everything sprang into existence from that nothingness. Either way, there's just this blind faith that has to come into play. So that's my view on it. Go ahead.
Recently come across a tidbit. I forgot where I saw this. They said it appears some materialist scientists recently have tried to resurrect Sir Fred Hoyle's old steady state theory, because they realize the theistic implications of the Big Bang hypothesis, like she was talking about a while ago. Those who accept the Big Bang normally have a real hard time, with that, getting away from metaphysics. So to maintain it's just been, stasis all the way back forever, they have to have some sort of steady state theory, which was long ago discredited because it flies against all the evidence we see.
Yeah. But I mean, either way, you still, you have to come up with where did it all come from, even if it's, steady state. Again, that's just, it's
Well, the
another
idea,
coat of
the
paint.
idea, it's another nothingness view. It says that you have hydrogen, for example, atoms are just popping up out of the void. And many people misunderstood Hoyle and some of his cohorts at first when they posited that. And they thought, well, he meant that there are other entities, other forms of energy that coalesce or condense in different parts of the universe and condense into matter. And that's what he's saying. But if you go back and read, he says, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it literally comes out of the void. It comes and fills in the space. So as the universe expands, there's always a steady amount of matter that's popping hydrogen, generally positive, simplest atoms, into existence. And then, of course, later it's worked on and becomes heavier elements and so on. But I mean, that long ago, mostly it was from this cosmic background radiation background stuff they've seen through these recently super duper telescope that were the death knell of that theory. So
Yeah. Again, there's all kinds of piecemeal. Oh well, this is going on, so this might explain it. This is going on, this might explain it, and sometimes they cobble things together. The idea that, and you could, as far as I know, I've never heard it gainsaid that anti-electrons pop into existence, but then they immediately hit an electron and they're annihilated. Within that uncertainty principle, delta T time. Again, that goes back to the old theory that, at some point, at T0 of the universe's incipience, that there was nothing, energy was borrowed in massive quantities from the nothingness and could have been paid back. But that nothingness that suddenly spawned massive amounts of energy coalesced into particles that then formed the infinitesimally small pinpoint, which was the Big Bang seed. And the universe exploded into everything. And at that point, it couldn't be taken back, right? So all this, so it's kind of like, I guess it's like you borrow a bunch of money and then you blow up the bank maybe, or I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good analogy so you don't have to pay the money back. And then there's nobody left to, put you in jail for robbing the bank. Anyway, it's just a weird view because that would have to happen. The amount of energy that exists in the universe is just, it's incalculable. I mean, you might could put a number to it, but it would be, in our puny brains, probably wouldn't hold the number of digits, the number of neurons. It probably far outstrips the number of neurons in our brain. Which brings up some other interesting points about, virtual reality, living in simulations kind of things, because there is a finite nature. The universe is finite in nature, right? It is not infinite, obviously. And so if you were going to create a simulation of the universe, it would have to then contain more than the universe contains, because you'd have to simulate the simulation itself. And it's kind of a infinite regression that doesn't make sense. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting off into science fiction territory here, but that's where it always leads when you get into this stuff, because it's all fiction. Because we know the facts, and anything that is not the fact is a fiction, right? Can I coin that phrase here, perhaps? All right. So people who take the materialist view think that matter and space just happen to exist, have always existed. Nobody knows why, and the matter behaving in certain fixed ways just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves, which is another can of worms. So not only do you have to produce the material to make everything, then you got to take the impossible step of inanimate matter becoming a organic matter, right? By one chance in 1,000, something hit our sun and made it produce the planets, and by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets, and So some of the matter on the earth came alive, and then by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed into things like us. So that's the first view, which, of course, it sounds ridiculous. The other view is a religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious, has purposes, prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe partly for purposes we do not know, but partly at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself to the extent of having minds. Please don't think that one of these views was held a long time ago and that the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. And this note, too, you cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Okay, so these are two worldviews. Materialist view, matter and space exist by chance. Human consciousness is an accidental byproduct, and there is no inherent meaning or purpose. So that is a lot of modern man, just in general. The religious view, however, is a mind-like reality exists behind the universe. The universe was created with purpose, and humans were made to reflect aspects of this creator. One of these is very bleak. I'll leave it to you to figure out which one. So let's talk about the limits of science. So he makes the point that science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, I pointed the telescope to such and such a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th and saw so-and-so. Or I put some of this stuff in a pot and heated it to such and such a temperature and it did so-and-so. Do not think I'm saying anything against science. I'm only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more I believe he would agree with me that this is the job of science, and a very useful and necessary job it is too. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the thing science observes, something of a different kind, this is not a scientific question. So science describes how things behave, but it can't answer why anything exists at all. There's no why to it, right? Now, I guess you could say, well, okay, why does Coca-Cola exist? Well, Pemberton invented it, right? Wasn't he the guy? So you might could say that, but the why of the existence of the chemical components of Coca-Cola is a different thing. Whether something exists beyond observable phenomena or questions of ultimate meaning and purpose. So it describes how things behave. We can observe things, but we can't define or derive purpose. What is the purpose of these things or meaning behind these things? So science works by experiments, but why anything comes to be there at all is not a scientific question. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. So if you can't see, smell, hear, touch, taste, or feel it, how do you know that it's there? I mean, that's the only senses we have, right? So if there's something behind, it has to either remain hidden or make itself manifest, known in some way. The statement that there is any such thing and the statement that there is no such thing are neither of them statements that science can make. And we've made that argument, you know that. Atheism can't say that there is no God, because unless you've scoured every corner of the universe, you can't say that God doesn't exist because you haven't been everywhere. So you can't really call yourself an atheist unless it's on faith. Real scientists do not usually make those kind of statements. It's usually the journalists and the popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half-baked science from textbooks who go in for them. After all, it is really a matter of common sense. Supposing science ever became complete so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Would remain just as they were. So even if we could scour every corner of the universe, we're never going to be able to answer those because they're philosophical questions. They're not scientific questions, would be my answer there, would be my observation there. So let's talk about the unique position of humanity. And again, I asked the AI to point out some Bible verses, and this time, however, I took Philip's suggestion. I actually asked it to justify, tell me why you picked this verse. So the response here, the unique position of humanity, humans have inside information about themselves. This reveals a moral law that we did not invent, we cannot forget, feel obligated to obey, and the moral law cannot be observed from the outside. So it again, and we've pointed this verse out before, it points out Romans 2:14-15, for when Gentiles who do not have law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. So it says, this passage confirms Lewis's point that moral law is innate within humans. We experience it internally as a reality we didn't create but feel obligated to follow. So I will expound upon that in the next slide, but let me go ahead and get through the material that pertains to this slide. Now, the position would be quite hopeless but for this. There is one thing and only one thing in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation, and that one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. So we live as men and women, again, in the general sense, mankind. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. And because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law, which they did not make and cannot quite forget even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could they? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. Does that make sense? So if you were observing a person and you didn't have that understanding, if you could only watch what we did and not listen to our justifications or that internal struggle, a description of that, then how would that being that is observing us know that there is this moral law, that we even know that there's a moral law? So in the same way, if there were anything above or behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from outside, could never hope to discover it. So if there's anything going on, if there's like, that movie, The Secret Life of Pets, where all the pets, or Toy Story, all the toys come to life and they're having these conversations. We know nothing about that because they don't act like that in our presence, and we have no way of knowing because we can't observe that. So anyway, that's his point, is that if you're an outside observer looking at human beings, you wouldn't know that. We have that inside information. So before I go on to the next section here, so I asked it, I said, there's some question about your interpretation of Romans 2:14-15. So I said, can you, look at the context? I want you to look at the prior context. I want you to look at everything and just tell me. And so here is the response that I got. So here is its justification, right? So for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Romans 2:14 through 15 comes in the midst of Paul's broader argument in Romans 1 through 3, where he is establishing the universal sinfulness of humanity and need for the gospel. Here's the progression. Romans 1:18 through 32, Paul argues that Gentiles that are non-Jews, non-Jews, are guilty before God because they suppress the truth about God that is evident in creation. Then he turns to address those in Romans 2:1 through 16 who judge others, particularly Jews who might judge Gentiles, and explains that God's judgment is impartial. And then he says Romans 2:14 through 15 specifically for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, their law unto themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. And then he says, or the AI says, Paul then directly addresses Jews who rely on the law but fail to keep it. And I think that this is I think that it's about basically circumcision and uncircumcision and that controversy, I suppose. And we can talk about that some more. I can pull up the verses and we can read it. But it says the immediate verses before Romans 2:14 through 15 are crucial to understanding its context, which is for all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. So, it's not enough to know the law. If you're not doing the law, if you're not following the rules, if you just know the rules, that doesn't make you special. Because even if you don't know the rules and you're not following the rules, well, then you're going to die in sin, not having known the rules. But even if you know the rules and you don't follow the rules, it's just as bad. Or perhaps it's worse because you knew to follow the rules and you didn't do it. We know that's true too. All right, so Paul is making the case that, and again, this is the AI's words. Number one, God judges everyone impartially based on their actual conduct, which I think we would agree with that. Having special knowledge, i.e. the Mosaic law, doesn't provide an advantage if you don't live by it. That I think I agree with. Even those without the written law, Gentiles have a moral intuition that functions similarly to the law. Now, that's the thing, I guess, where we would have some controversy, because we know, coming from our understanding of history, that everyone has had some exposure to God's law. Even the Gentiles, they have some vestige of it. Now, is it passed down? I think we got into this last week. Is it something that is passed down, orally or through, training of the parents because they received it from their parent? You ought to do this because, this is the way my father did it. This is the way my father did it, on back to Adam and Eve, right? Or Noah.
Well, it is stated, point number 3, that it's talking about a written law. The contrast is the Gentiles do not have a written law.
Yeah.
But they do have a sense of law.
But I guess the question is, where does that moral intuition come from? Is it just something that's ingrained?
He doesn't answer that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the AI doesn't say that. But this is what the AI plucks out to tell you that, that Lewis's argument about being able to, without any extra sensory, without any kind of, natural or supernatural understanding, you can glean these laws, right? And it's just innate somehow in human beings. I think that's what it seems like. That's what Lewis's argument is. Well, we can't. We can look at nature and all we can know about a rock is that it falls, and that's a law, if you want to call that a law. But there's something that we know based on our own knowledge of ourselves, that there is something that exists beyond us. But again, I go back to the question, how do we know that? I mean, is it something that we would know if our parents hadn't taught us that there's right and wrong? I mean, everybody tells their kids there's right and wrong, right? I mean, even the worst bandit, they're going to say, well, it's good to rob banks because, we're going to stick it to the man. There's always some sort of moral right and wrong that is passed down to children. So, you know, you know, I'm trying to look at this from all the angles and not just assume that we just have some innate, we're just born with it. You just take a baby just born, no interaction with human beings, and put them out, or you clone. How about that? We clone a baby, not even tethered to a human being, and then you put him out in the middle of nowhere, and somehow you get him food, and would that human being grow up and have some innate knowledge of that there's good and evil, that there's a moral law? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Not apart from a social context, I don't think they would.
Yeah.
By definition.
I think we just have to. We can't actually perform that experiment. It's immoral, right? So we're just going to have to go with what we know, go with our instincts, what we have observed, and say that it has to come from teaching, some sort of teaching, regardless. So even the Gentiles, and again, I'm wanting to make sure that we understand the context properly. That even these Gentiles, that they have a form of the law. They have this kind of innate this understanding that has been inculcated in them, but it had to have stemmed from an origination point. It still had to come from God ultimately, right? I mean, I hope I'm expressing myself correctly, that it's not just something that's programmed into us. We don't have. I think you would be hard pressed to say that, because then you get off into I can never think of that guy's name. Calvinism. And then you get into the Calvinistic idea, that you're pre-programmed. We pop in, and we're going to be saved or we're not going to be saved. So I think you get too close to that kind of, predestination kind of idea if you say that we are born with a moral compass. Even I think that we are born with the ability to discern morally, right? That's something that animals don't necessarily have. I mean, I can't imagine that they have that, at least the kind of understanding we do. I'm sure they understand what's good and bad. I mean, I know it's bad to bite a little baby, right? I mean, they have that kind of understanding. But exactly, and a dog too. There are plenty of examples of dogs that cause harm to humans, and it's just do they feel bad about it? All the maulings, and the 4 and 5 year olds that get mauled to death, or the monkey that rips that woman's face off. I mean, they don't have that same sense of right and wrong, but we do, but it has to be cultivated. And if it didn't, then why would we need the gospel? Why would we need God's word? I mean, that's kind of the ultimate point, right? I mean, and that is, if you carry it on to the ad absurdum, right, you would say, well, if we already had the right and wrong compass, moral compass built into us, and we have that capacity, then we wouldn't need the gospel. We'd just do the right thing all the time. But we don't. And why do we have to have preachers, right? So we could be taught the right thing to do, to be taught these commandments. If we just had them ingrained, then what would we need it for? So again, we're not robots. We have to learn, and we spend a lifetime learning and reading and trying to get better. Okay, so that's all. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, so to speak, when it comes to that section. And I think really the way Paul continues, it basically comes down to circumcision versus uncircumcision. He's talking about, does it really matter if you're circumcised, if you're not following the law? And isn't the uncircumcised that's actually following the law and doing the things, doesn't that make him justified because he's actually doing the things that God has said to do? So it's not just knowing the law, and it's not just these, the things like that, like the circumcision or uncircumcision that are important. It's actually the doing the things, which is ironic because he's doing this in a section of scripture that a lot of people want to take and abuse and say, well, it's just faith only. That's all it is, just nothing but faith. But he's constantly talking about doing the entire time. He's talking about doing, following the law, doing the things that you're supposed to do. So in my mind, they're both the same thing. Faith and works are, you're doing the things out of faithfulness, right? Anyway, I didn't mean to get off into I don't want to get off into a study but anyway, let's move on to the next section. Evidence of something beyond. All right, the position of the question then is like this. We want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. And why do we want to know that? Why do we want to know that? You want to know why? I'm just going to remind us. That's why. Either nothing means anything, nothing has meaning or purpose, or we were created for a purpose. Can you imagine? I'm not retired yet. I mean, I would like to be. That would be a nice thing. But could you imagine just being retired and not having any purpose whatsoever? I mean, sometimes it's difficult for me at work if I don't have something that I'm working on, and there's nothing going on. You're just, man, I'm kind of bored. But worse than that is it becomes kind of an existential crisis. Then it's like, well, if I'm paid to be here and I'm feeling this uneasiness and this antsiness because I don't have anything to do, then what'll it be like when I really don't have anything to do, and hopefully still getting paid somehow to do nothing? So we have to have purpose. I mean, and that's just the bottom line. And you can see, and I've heard so many stories, you can tell I get a lot of YouTube videos about retirement now. I don't know why. It's not like I'm old enough. But, you hear all these stories about people that, they kept working, and they finally retired, and everything's going to happen. And then they just die. And I just thought about I realized as I was saying that, but at least he died what he loved doing and doing what he loved doing. And he had a good job, not just, making widgets or, welding things, whatever. But I hear so many times people retire and they're finally going to get to go out, and I'm going to go to church more. I'm going to do more church stuff. I'm going to volunteer down at the soup kitchen. I'm going to go do some traveling. I'm, going to do a little bit of everything, and then they die a few weeks later.
This is off the subject, but you will remember a couple months ago when we were negotiating with the radio station in Americus, WISK.
Yeah.
I had you get in touch with Thurston Clary.
Yeah.
Remember? Well, I was going to get in touch with him to send him the files for this coming month. When I brought up my email to find his address to respond to him and send him that page, I got a note from somebody else at the station that said, unfortunately, Thurston passed away unexpectedly 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
so
man.
I'll be your point man from now on.
Oh, wow.
Then looked it up and said he was a big man in America. He's real influential. He was just 65 years old.
Oh, my goodness.
A DJ, well known in town. So it just kind of stunned me to hear that.
Yeah.
After talking with him and thinking, I thought he's a really nice guy. I liked him. Real pleasant to talk with on the phone. I have his number in my contacts. I was about to call. That's all gone now.
Yeah, that's terrible. But then the opposite of that, when you got everything to live for, it seems like, and you got stuff to do, but when you don't have stuff to do, that seems to be, I don't know. There's stories both ways. People just kind of don't have anything to do, and then they just kind of keep persisting and hating life because they're bored, or lonely, whatever. But you have the other stories too. I mean, it kind of cuts both ways. So maybe I don't have a good point there, but we all need a purpose. And if we don't have a purpose, then life is long and miserable, and it just goes on and on and on. And we hate.
You know, the preacher me has to respond. Everybody in this room has a purpose, for sure.
Oh, sure.
And that's to evangelize and build up this congregation and influence people for good.
Well, we know we have a purpose, but it's the secular person out there who doesn't think. It's the secular person who there's no meaning other than just watching a new TV show, going to a new restaurant. But again, then you think about Ecclesiastes, and you think at some point, there's really nothing new when you get down to it, right? There's nothing new under the sun. Been there, done that. I've been through all of the different pleasures of the earth, and nothing satisfies. But again, that's because you're not addressing the real purpose of your life, which is not materialistic. It's supernatural. It's on the religious end of things, not the physical end of things. So again, I'm not sure exactly what I was trying to get there. Hopefully in all that rambling, there was a point that was made. But we want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there's a power behind it that makes it what it is. Since that power, if it exists, would not be one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. Let me say that again. Since that power, God, let's just say that, if that power exists, would be not one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. So we're not able, without some kind of divine intervention, if you will, to know this, because it's not observable unless it makes itself observable, right? There's only one case in which we can know whether there is anything more, namely our own case. And in that one case, we find there is. Or put it the other way around. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe, no more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or staircase or fireplace in that house. The only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. And that is just what we do find inside ourselves. Now, here's where maybe I would kind of differ, if I might. And clearly God makes himself known in the universe to us. I mean, he has shown himself, there have been many people in the history of the world who have seen either God or Christ. So he has made himself known physically in the universe. So I don't know. I'm just going to put that little editor's note here, and we'll see where he's going with this, okay? So, he says that, and if we're thinking of it in terms of God, if there was a controlling power outside the universe, which I would assume is God, isn't that what we're all assuming? Then God could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. So, again, I think I understand what he's trying to say, but I'm not sure that I would agree with it in the way that I understand what he's saying. God doesn't exist as a staircase or whatever, a fact inside. He is bigger than the universe. He is the creator of the universe, and therefore doesn't exist. But a manifestation of God can exist within the universe, right? I mean, clearly Christ exists in physical form. And of course, we know God is a spirit, right? I mean, so God's a spirit, but he has manifested his presence in the universe in a physical manner. But let's just continue. No more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or staircase or fireplace in the house. Well, now, if you're saying that he's constraining himself and that is only the form in which he exists, I would agree with that, right? So, God can't be a rock. God can't be, as the Mars Hill, when Paul's talking to him, as if God, exists in these earthen vessels or is these earthen vessels. That's, it's absurd. So, if you're looking at it from that perspective, God is not a finite part of the universe. It only exists as a finite part, physical part of the universe. I would agree with that. So the only way in which we'd expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. Again, let's just keep reading. And that is just what we do find inside ourselves. Surely this ought to arouse our suspicion. So I think the way he seems to be going with this, unless he makes a course correction, is that there's this still small voice kind of argument. You know what I'm saying? There's something that our conscience that God has implanted in us is guiding us in a certain way. In the only case where you can expect to get an answer, the answer turns out to be yes. And in the other cases where you do not get an answer, you see why you do not. Suppose someone asked me when I see a man in a blue uniform going down the street, leaving little paper packets at each house, why I suppose that they contain letters. I should reply, because whenever he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. Talking about the postman, right? And if he then objected, but you've never seen all these letters which you think the other people are getting, I should say, of course not, and I shouldn't expect to, because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I am allowed to open. So, again, we're getting into some kind of iffy territory, right? So he's saying, well, I understand the messages God is giving me is the way that I'm interpreting what he's saying, because I've gotten the messages he's given me. Now, I don't know what he's told you. So if he's going in that direction, then I think we're getting off track, right? The only packet I'm allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. I do not, of course, think that if I could get inside a stone or a tree, I should find exactly the same thing, just as I do not think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do. Now, I think that if he'd have said, well, I understand what it's like to be a human because I'm a human, but I can't understand what it's like to be a rock because I'm not a rock, and so therefore I can't really speak to whether there's some, moral code. I could agree with that. It's kind of a non.
I think that's what his analogy is.
But I think if he stopped there, but again, he says, then he invokes this other idea. Specifically, when I open that particular man called myself, right? So he says now me. So again, when you're not saying mankind, like I'm the same as every man. The question I have is he saying that just as I do not think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do? See, that's where I think that, we should be a little cautious, because if he's saying that, I'm getting this letter from God, the Creator, and I'm interpreting things in the way that my letter was addressed to me, but I can't speak to all the other people that have gotten letters from the Creator. If he's saying that, then I think we have to be careful. So let me just finish this chapter, and then we'll have to quit, and we can converse about that some more. So I can't get inside a stone or tree, just as I don't think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do. I should expect, for instance, to find that the stone had to obey the law of gravity, and that whereas the sender of the letters merely tells me to obey the law of my human nature, he compels the stone to obey the laws of its stony nature. But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. So, he's saying that the way that I understand what he's saying is, everybody's getting these letters. Stones get different directives than humans do, right? So stones just fall. And we can't tell whether there's any other law that a stone obeys other than this one particular law. But we really can't know that it's a law because we just know that stones do this thing when they drop. So we can't necessarily say that it's a law. But we infer that, or we assume that there is based on the empirical evidence. You can't look at a human being and their actions and say empirically that there's a law, just looking at the prima facie evidence, right? But I know because I am a man and I understand that I have this inner conflict and that there is the things that I think I ought to do versus the things that maybe I want to do, and they come into conflict, that there's got to be some superior law governing me. So I can understand that because I'm a human being, whereas I don't know what a rock is feeling. So if he means that, and he says that it's universal across every human being, that all we can know is that there is a moral law, a natural law, then yeah, I would agree with that. But again, I don't want to go to the extent of saying that this is what I understand and maybe you understand something different, and so there's maybe a different moral law for you. If we're going in that direction, then I think that there's a problem because we're trying to establish.
In the beginning of his introductory remarks, he made clear he didn't think that there is a universal law code that people everywhere recognize, even though the specifics might differ on like how many wives you can have.
Mm-hmm.
There's still the basic view you can't have just any woman you want, that kind of thing. He already established that we all are under a universal moral law, I think.
So, yeah, we'll study some more about that. Like I say, I kind of try and temper all of this with, trust but verify. We need to listen to what he's saying, but let's try and keep in mind what we know to be the truth. And we'll take what we can where we can, and the things that maybe are a little iffy, we just kind of eject that or put that to the side. So let me stop the recording. We'll stop.